Welcome to part 2 of my craft breakdown of For the Wolf by Hannah Whitten. In part 1 we talked about characters, we talked about their arcs, their beliefs, their fears. If you haven't seen part 1, I recommend you do that first. I will link it in the cards and in the description below. Here in part 2, we're really going to be looking at the different plots that I'm going to be analyzing and which elements I'm going to be looking at. The breakdown of the different plots and all the different plot elements and my charts and graphs associated with those. So let's get going. So I'm going to be following 3 different plots for this. So you have the main plot, which focuses on the question of will Red find purpose and embrace the wilder wood, aka embrace her magic. And that is definitely the most major one, and both of the other kind of side plots feed into that. The secondary plot is basically the romance between Eamon and Red, and that kind of focuses on the questions of will the two of them get together? Will they learn to rely on each other? Will Eamon let go of this need to do everything and this fear of letting other people be hurt? If he lets them help him. So that kind of is Eamon's character development and also the romance plotline. The other plotline is Neve's, and it's basically will Neve save her sister? And that kind of gets tied into basically everything that's happening on the Valida side. The things that I focused on, I guess, mapping out for this were general plot beats. I ended up being able to find most of the Save the Cat beats, not all of them. Anything that was really a plot point, so anything that moved the plot forward. And the things that I kind of categorized these into were plot twists, plot hinges or turning points, and then setbacks and advances or wins and losses. And then the last thing I kind of kept track of was any times the stakes were upped or I guess decreased, anytime there was significant tension, and anytime there was significant conflict. And so these are basically what I guess the biggest strengths of the story were. Like when I was reading it, it just felt like every chapter was like the stakes are increasing, the stakes are increasing, the stakes are increasing. And it just like kept the book moving forward and feeling like it gave me as the reader urgency in reading it, where I was just like really flipping through the pages. So I really wanted to kind of chart that out so that when I chart it out in other books, I can kind of compare it and compare those feelings and understand, you know, why I felt that way when I was reading. Okay, so I got this set up, which is really cool. So what you're looking at here is kind of how I kept track of all of the different elements. So you can see on the timeline, you have all the different chapters. And I did kind of do the percentages based off the chapters and not by word count or anything. It was just easier to do it that way. But there were 35 chapters, an epilogue, and 7 Valida interludes, which are Neve's perspective. Each of these little green dots are going to be scenes that focused on the main plot line, which is Red's plot. And then the blue dots are Neve's plot, which is her trying to save Red and destroy the Wilderwood. And then the pink ones are the romance plot lines. And you can sort of see they're pretty well distributed in here. Almost everything focuses on Red's plot. There's not a lot of scenes where it doesn't come into play at all. But then because all the characters are so intertwined with their goals and their fears and their motives, and because their plots are pretty intertwined too, you can see there's a lot of overlap here. The only ones that don't really overlap are Neve's and the romance plot lines. But then along the bottom, you can kind of see all these little symbols based off which plot line it was, where I saw tension, where I saw a hinge or a twist, a loss, a setback, a win, an advance, all that kind of stuff. You can see with the romance plotline, there's just tons of tension building up all the way up to about the halfway point here. You just see like tons of tension, tons of conflict, and then lots of like losses, lots of wins. Like it's a very back and forth thing, which works really well for like a kind of more slow burn, high intensity romance plot, which I enjoyed. And then you can sort of see with Red's plot, which is this sort of top group here, all the wins and losses kind of here, how this middle part is more wins, but the beginning had lots of twists in it, and the end has lots of losses, followed by the wins. You can see all these stakes, and each of these S's is basically a scene where something happened that increased the stakes. And you can see there's a lot of them, like, even relatively from the beginning, it just, the stakes keep building and they keep building faster and faster and faster. When I applied the Save the Cat beats to this and tried to, I guess, kind of pinpoint them, I focused really on Red's plot. So you can kind of see at the beginning, there was an intro of desires, theme stated, the whole setup period, you had your debate period following the catalyst. And then the break into two was following, if you see that first hinge there, was basically where you have that break into two. And then kind of what follows is the sort of fun and games, or the promise of the premise, which for this is really her going to the Wilderwood and trying to figure out her magic and figure out what's going on with the wolf and the Wilderwood and everything. So that's really what that section is. And it went well past the 50% mark chapter-wise. The break into two was almost right at 25%, which is basically the recommendation from Save the Cat. The midpoint I didn't have until chapter 21, which was, I guess, maybe like 63% of the way through the chapters, which definitely meant the fun and games section was a lot longer. And my inclination is to think that that is something that could in other novels cause like a saggy middle, right? Because not much is happening. But I think that here you have all these stakes increasing. So like even while she's kind of slowly, very slowly having these small wins, the stakes are increasing, the stakes are increasing, the stakes are increasing. And you have stuff going on with the romance that like makes it interesting and engaging. So even though the midpoint's kind of really far away, and then I have the break into three again, like past the 75% mark, it's about almost maybe like 82% of the way in. So the stuff at the end kind of happens really quick. Once things start to happen, like it just really tumbles really quickly. And I think in a lot of ways that really helped the buildup of the tension and the stakes, because you don't really have much of a resolution period here. Like you have one chapter that sort of gives a little bit of resolution, or what do they call it, denouement or whatever, after the climax of Red's plot. But that chapter 35 is also the sort of climax of the romance plot, sort of, the second climax. It doesn't feel like a resolution in the same way. And then the epilogue was setting up basically book two, where it's increasing stakes. So this book really does not give you any time to breathe. And I think that's intentional. That's part of like the strong parts of this book. Like it is not something that you're reading to just kind of like sit and chill and relax. That's definitely not what this is. Okay, so this is specifically Red's plot. So you can see at the bottom I laid out those Save the Cat beats and where they kind of set up. I have that 25, 50, and 75% marked, as well as the break into two, the midpoint, and the break into three, which I base those off this plot, so you can kind of see each of those that break into two kind of goes up to this big hinge right here, the midpoint goes up to here, and the break into three goes to right here. So her plot is sort of set up at the very beginning where she is basically preparing to be sacrificed. She's reaching her birthday, the point where she's basically going to be taken to the Wilderwood and potentially going to die. Really her only goal here is separating herself from those that she loves so that she can't hurt them, because, you know, she has this magic in her that almost killed her sister at one point, even though her sister doesn't remember. She'd rather die than hurt all of her friends and her family and her sister. So that's sort of where she starts at the beginning, and you sort of really get to see what she really wants, like how she's talking about how she's not really useful and will she be enough, and it kind of sets up this idea of like she needs something to live for. She needs to be someone. Like she's been told her entire life that she's only useful so far as being a sacrifice, and that does a lot to a person's psyche. So then this setup actually, I have it extending all the way past when she gets to the Wilderwood. Like, I don't have her entering the Wilderwood as the catalyst or the break into two or the inciting incident, because it doesn't really change her decision, right? Before she leaves, the first two chapters, Neve tells her she could stay. Her and Eric are trying to get her to run away. They're like, we have it all planned out. We just need to run. We'll take you away. You don't have to go. And she says no, of course, because she thinks she's going to kill everyone. But even though that is technically a decision she's making, like, it's not a change. Like, that is her view from the beginning. She has to go. And then once she gets into the Wilderwood and she meets Aemon for the first time, he sort of gives her the same deal. Like, okay, you're here. You upheld the deal. Now you can leave. I don't need you. And she's like, yeah, no, I'm not leaving. Because again, she believes that if she goes back, she's going to kill all the people she loves. That's not really her making a decision. Her entering the Wilderwood, even though she survived and she didn't expect to, that's not really an inciting incident. Like, yes, it provides the opportunity for like, oh, she's still alive. She has to figure out what she's going to do with her life now that she actually has one. It's the start. Like, maybe I have it marked, I think, as the catalyst, right? Because it's now she has to figure out what she's going to do to survive, but it's definitely not her making a decision yet with how she's going to do that or what she's actually working towards. Like, she doesn't have a goal. The point that I actually have as her, like, break into two, basically when she's decided to help Aemon, she's seen over the last few chapters, maybe Aemon isn't handling everything as well as he could be. He's struggling. She's realizing that he's not keeping up with it and all these people are trying to help, and maybe she could help too. Her new goal is basically like, I can use my blood like Fife and Lyra do. So that's kind of that break into two. And she's like, I'm gonna help. I'm going to help lower the burden off Aemon, but her misbelief is still that she's not going to use her magic. But then there's this big setback when she's trying to do this. Aemon finds her and is basically like, yeah, you're not using your blood. It's going to get you killed. I'm not going to let you do it. And then it's like, oh, well, what's she going to do now? Because what he wants her to do is to use her magic. He doesn't think that that will cause her to die. And she's like, no, I can't use my magic. So it takes a little while for her to kind of ramp back up again and kind of get to the point where she agrees that she will use her magic. And this is the scene where Aemon basically offers to have them be bound, I guess, which is sort of like a folk marriage, I think is how it's described. So they'll get married to kind of satisfy the Wilderwood, who says it needs to. It wants both of them, right? And that is the point where she decides to try her magic. And this kind of is that switching point where, like, oh, you were kind of, things were maybe not getting worse, but like she wasn't getting anywhere, and now she's gonna start trying. This is that second hinge, but it's still the same end goal where she wants to help, but like how she's gonna do it is completely different. And then immediately following that brief moment of hope and feeling of like her actually making progress, she completely fails. She tries to use her magic. She has a panic attack. It's a huge setback. So you have that brief moment and then an immediate loss, which, like, again, this is all about that tension, those stakes. The rest of the book up until the midpoint is her trying to help Aemon save the Wilderwood. So she's trying to use her magic. She's trying to help him. And if you remember on, let's see, the full element breakdown, this is that fun and games section, and you can see there's little wins here, right? She's not making a ton of progress, but it's enough to kind of feel like she's moving forward, and this is also coupled a lot with romance, which we'll get to later. So then the midpoint, basically Aemon gives her the mirror so that she can see her sister, and she realizes that her sister is trying to destroy the Wilderwood, and that's why the Wilderwood is falling apart. That's why they're having so much trouble and why Aemon is like basically suffering so much. And so she's like, oh, if I want to help Aemon, if I want to help the Wilderwood, I have to stop Neve. And she thinks that she just has to basically go back and be like, hey Neve, like, I'm cool, we're all fine, and like convince her that, you know, the Wilderwood isn't dangerous to them, that they were lied to, and, you know, they don't actually want the Five Kings to be released, etc., etc., etc. So that's kind of that big turning point of her goals. So then, you know, she goes back to Valida. Aemon manages to let her leave. And then it kind of starts to have setbacks because Neve doesn't believe her. Kiri, which is the order person that's working with Neve to kind of destroy the Wilderwood, basically is like locks her up and imprisons her, and she sees Arik, her old lover, has basically been taken over by one of the 5 kings who they've managed to release. She's basically like an all is lost moment. I would not call this a Dark Night of the Soul beat, because she's not to blame for any of it, if that makes sense. Like, the way I understand the Dark Night of the Soul is basically it's the point where you realize that your fears and your misbelief and making your decisions based off your fear is what caused you to be in this situation and caused you to almost lose a chance of achieving your desire, your goals, and you've done this to yourself. I need to overcome my fear, overcome my belief or my misbelief, and do X, right? At the end of the Dark Night of the Soul beat, they realize what they need to do, and they have that internal growth to kind of have that new goal and know what they want to do. But then the climax is when they externally actually do it. But that's not what this is in For the Wolf. She is imprisoned because Kiri took advantage of Neve, because Neve doesn't believe her, because Kiri's lied to Neve and made her think that, you know, the Wilderwood has basically brainwashed Red, and it's not Red's fault. It's not like she could have done anything to fix that. She had to leave because if she didn't, her magic, like, she couldn't control her magic. Even though her magic isn't a curse, she didn't know how to use it, and it probably would have ended up killing somebody. So she had to leave. It's not her fault that Kiri is doing this. There was no chance for her to stop her. Like, there is no, like, I've done a horrible thing and I've let all these things happen because of my fear and misbelief. Second, she's not overcoming a fear or misbelief in this. Like, what she does basically at the break into 3 is she accepts the Wilderwood's anchor, right? She's completely and fully embracing the Wilderwood to be a partner to Aemon, to help save it, and that's what kind of lets her break free, and that's what she needed to do all along, if that makes sense. But it's not that she wasn't willing to do that before. Like, at the point that you have this hinge here, right after she decides that she's going to try the magic, she's willing to help the Wilderwood. She just doesn't understand what she needs to do. They don't really know what has to happen. So it isn't until she accepts the anchor, basically right after, I think, Solomir, one of the kings, or Kiri, I don't remember who says it while she's in prison, but basically says the thing that makes a light bulb goes off, and she's like, oh, I just need to accept the anchor, and then she's like, I'm gonna accept the anchor, and boom. Like, that's how she breaks out of that all is lost moment. So definitely not Dark Night of the Soul. I don't know if I think the plot could have been, like, improved by having it be a little more like that. Like, I think that's just, like, not everything has to have that beat, and that would have been a lot slower, more emotional, more, like, really deep emotional moment, which isn't really... There's character development here, and, like, hard feelings, and there's dark feelings and guilt and all that stuff, but, like, it's not really that... I don't think that would have quite fit into this plot line. But break into 3. She's accepted the anchor. She is basically brought the Wilderwood back up to full strength, and she's like, we're ready to go. She leaves the keep and goes back to the Wilderwood. And you're kind of at a high point there where you're like, oh great, Wilderwood's at full strength. They can do this. They've got this. This is also around the time that there's the initial win moment, I guess, of the romance, which we'll get to that. Wow, this is going to be a really long video. Okay, then you have another sort of, not all is lost, but like an initial setback, which is where Raph shows up and is like, Neve's gone, like gone, you need to help your sister. And then they realize that Kiri and Solomir are on the edge of the Wilderwood trying to open the gate. So you have that kind of setback again where all of that, like, bad guys close in again kind of happens. Aemon basically sacrifices himself to break Red from the anchor so that he basically takes in all of the Wilderwood into himself and basically is fully transformed into the Wilderwood, I guess, in order to battle Solomir and close the gate, I think. So Red isn't doing anything there, really. She basically, the anchor gets pulled out of her, and she just kind of turns around and runs off. There's basically two forms of Auric now. There's the form that's controlled by Solomir, and then basically like the shadow almost, which is Auric. So she finds Auric, and she knows that, like, they talk, if she kills him, basically it'll force Solomir out of the body, and I think back into the Shadowlands, which will stop the gate, maybe? I'm not sure if that stops the gate. But so she does that. She stabs her friend. It's this heartfelt moment. And then she has to kind of try and wake up Red, but then Red kind of, or not Red, Neve is in this coffin where she's like sort of connected to the Shadowland magic. And I think that's what they're using to open the gate. Is this magic that Neve has sort of embodied in order to try to kill the Wilderwood to unleash her sister, is now like completely enveloped her sort of, and Red sort of wakes her up, and then Neve wakes up and pulls the magic back in, and that keeps the gate from opening. And then there's one more chapter and an epilogue after that, so saving the Wilderwood and stopping the gate from opening isn't really anything that Red does, per se. Like, she doesn't have a lot of agency at that, in my opinion. And then the next scene is sort of the resolution where she takes back half of the Wilderwood anchor from Aemon. So the Wilderwood basically is split between them, and they are both like, basically she gets Aemon back. He's still sort of different because now the Wilderwood magic is inside of him and half inside of her, but they're both still like Aemon and Red, where for a while he wasn't. So that final climax is like right at the end of the book. And I think I mentioned this already, but the epilogue isn't resolution. It's, I mean, it has a little bit of resolution. You see what they're doing afterwards, but it's mostly laying stakes for the next book. So it's just like stakes and tension, stakes and tension, stakes and tension this whole time. Okay, so this is the stakes of the A-plot. I tried to map it out so that it like sort of grew normally, but like as you can see, it just is constantly increasing the entire time. Like, the stakes start out kind of high because you're like, oh, Red's gonna die when she goes into the woods, and you have a lot of like, you know, she's gonna die. And then she doesn't die, but then she starts to realize that like bad things are happening, the Wilderwood is falling apart, Aemon needs help, etc. And like the stakes just keep rising and rising and rising, and even in that 75% mark kind of, where she's like in the all is lost, and the big setbacks, the stakes are still going up, right? Like, this is just basically a really steep cliff until it just drops out of nowhere and then starts building up again in the epilogue. And this is really, again, what I think is what made this such a compelling read and such a page turner, is because the stakes were always growing. Every single one of these little ticks on this is where something happened that showed that things were worse or things got worse. And this was a really cool method for doing this. Like, I think that there was a trade-off here, right? I think that they could have been stronger emotional beats, there could have been more world building, there could have been other things. But in order to keep this tension so strong and these stakes increasing so much, like, it had to be this really fast-paced turn pager in order to make that work. This is the romance plot, and I just took the picture of the top. You could sort of see the stakes, the red. Just ignore the red right now. This is basically that B plot with Aemon where there's romance, and this is a lot of tension that comes in. So you can sort of see there's a lot more rises and falls in this than the main one. The fun and games section for Red's plot, the middle, I guess from that second hinge to the midpoint is just very slow gradual wins while stakes are constantly increasing, while this one is really up and down, really push and pull. It is not until literally the last chapter of the book that Red and Aemon are together for good. So it really, really is this slow burn. It really is very high tension, which pulls into that very high stakes, very compelling page-turning aspect of the first plot and the stakes of the first plot, where, like, you know, they sort of kind of are like dancing around each other a little bit, and then he's like, you can't use you know, your blood, you can't do it. And he pushes her away because, again, he doesn't want to let her help because he thinks he'll cause her death. He thinks she's almost as good as dead already, maybe at the beginning. And the closer he gets to her, the more afraid he is that he's going to cause her to die. I will say almost all of this push and pull and tension was due to Aemon. It was due to his fears, his misbelief, his not wanting to let her in, him trying to push her away. I don't think there was a single one of these setbacks that was because of her. So she was basically just like a willing, like, hey, I'm here. Hey, I want to help you. Hey, I'm into you. And he was the one pushing your way, pulling you closer, pushing your way, pulling closer. So some of the big, like, moments here. So, like, this first big peak at the 50% mark, she kind of realizes as she's using her magic that basically the Wilderwood wants them together. So the Wilderwood is kind of pushing them together. That's sort of why they get bonded together. Yeah. And why, while they're trying to get her to be able to control her magic, like, she can do it more when he's there, which, like, leads into, like, some sexy, like, kissing scenes where, like, she's trying to control her magic and she's like, I need you closer. And he's like, is this close enough? No. Closer. So, like, her building up her magic in that fun and games is part of what is pulling Aemon closer, and then at the same time, as she rushes into danger to try and help because things are getting worse, she's trying to do things to stop it. He's suffering and doing even worse. They kiss a couple of times, but, like, immediately he pushes her away, and eventually, I think, it's right after the midpoint, I think, where you think they're going to be together, and then they're not. And the big kind of last fall into what would sort of be the equivalent of the all is lost moment is when, like, he kisses her and he loses control. Basically because he has been keeping the Wilderwood from coming for Red the entire time. And this is the moment when this, like, really becomes clear that every single moment he is using his magic to keep the Wilderwood away from her. And when they kiss and when he loses a little bit of control, he barely breaks away before the Wilderwood gets to her. So you kind of have this final moment of, like, he can't ever be with her. It doesn't feel quite as despairing as maybe, you know, it otherwise would have, because there's been so much push and pull, push and pull, push and pull. It kind of feels like another one of those pushes, I think. You kind of have this falling thing, like, she goes to Valida, and while she's there, until she figures out that she needs to accept the anchor, there really isn't anything going on in that plot line per se. So it's just like this very long, like, they're apart, but there's tension and, you know. And then this first big rise, this first big climax is her accepting the anchor, going back to the Wilderwood and realizing that, like, she doesn't need anyone to protect her anymore from the Wilderwood. He doesn't need to protect her anymore. She has made her decision. She's staying in the Wilderwood. She doesn't want to leave, even though Aemon kind of wants her to, / expects her to, / doesn't want to be holding her back. So she's like, we can be together again. And they do. He announces her love for her. That's this, like, little peak here. So they're together. And then you have this huge fall when basically he sacrifices himself for her to close the gate. And it's basically like he's gone and the Wilderwood is in his place, and just as, you know, you thought they were together for good, he's gone. And then, of course, she then takes the anchor back, bargains with the Wilderwood through Aemon, and, you know, they're together again. I do really like these kinds of romance that kind of have this slow burn. And it was really interesting to kind of look at it and see all these setbacks, all these pushes and pulls, because if they had never had a substantial win, right? Like, if it was just like a slow curve up, like, that wouldn't have been quite as tense. There wouldn't have been as much sexual tension going on, and it wouldn't have been quite as engaging. Okay, so just to pull back in the lower part of the sheet, which is where I had the, like, tension. And for this, I kind of use this as the, like, sexual tension, that like electricity between them that you feel as the reader, because that's kind of one of the things that really increases that page turning, like, compelling feel to it. And I kind of marked out the different notes where these things happen, but you can see, like, that tension is pretty constantly increasing. Even when they're kind of having that push and pull, the tension is still rising. Every time there's a loss, that tension is going up. And it's just like they're slowly pulling that rubber band further and further and further and further apart until it eventually, you know, snaps, where she has left, promised she's going to return. Aemon is like, no, you shouldn't return because you're just going to die, whatever, whatever. And she goes off to Valida and's like, I will return in 3 days. The stakes are really high because as she's leaving, or the tension is really high, the Wilderwood is basically like, if you don't come back, I'm going to have to take him. Which is sort of like what happens in that second all is lost moment where he rips the anchor out of her and takes all the Wilderwood into himself. You better come back is, you know, the gist of that. So she kind of knows, like, this really high tension that, like, if she doesn't come back, she will lose Aemon. So then the tension kind of falls. Mostly not because of anything that happens in the plot, but just because she's in Valida and you kind of, you know, she's going to come back and she's like, I'm going to come back. There isn't really any doubt. So the tension kind of falls off a little bit, and then you kind of have the increase of it as she kind of comes back. She's accepted the anchor, and like then they announce their love for each other. And then as the, you know, like their romance is advancing, the tension kind of falls, in my opinion, just because it's like, oh, they're together. There's not really any tension left. And then Aemon sacrifices himself, which ramps up the tension again, but it's still not as high as it was at that, like, they have to be together or she'll lose him kind of thing. I don't know, it just didn't feel as tense to me. And then as they finally get together, she takes in the Wilderwood and brings him back. You know, that's where the tension fully comes down. So at the end here, like, that was very interesting, but this is normally how I perceive romantic plot lines. I love that slow burn. When you have, like, in a romance where they get together at, like, the break into 3, basically, and, like, they're just together, it's like, I'm like, do I need to keep reading? There's been a number of romances that I just, like, stop reading then because I'm like, they're together. There's probably going to be something that, like, trips them up for a moment, and then they'll be, like, back together as they, like, you know, they had this big misunderstanding, and then they understand each other again, and then they're going to, like, be happy and make 10 babies in the epilogue. That's not, like, what I'm here for. So I really liked how this kind of worked. I maybe could have appreciated this all is lost moment where she's back in Valida being a little different. Like, maybe it would have increased the stakes even more if there was some doubt. Like, she had to make a choice, right? Because, like, there really isn't a choice because she's like, I'm coming back. If I don't, I'll lose him. The Wilderwood will fail, whatever, whatever, whatever. Like, you never, as the reader, think for a moment that she's not coming back. So I think that's something to, like, keep in mind, maybe? I don't know. I think that's interesting. This is kind of what I drew for Neve's plot. Just ignore this for the most part. It's just a visual aid that I'm looking at. But there was only like 7 chapters for Neve, and I changed kind of how this builds up in the overlay, which I'll get to in a moment, but she really doesn't make a choice until she agrees to help Kiri, which is right here, which is sort of her break into 2 for her inciting incident or whatever, which is almost like getting close to the 50% mark. And then she's, like, doing what Kiri asks, but she doesn't have a ton of, like, agency. She's basically agreed to do what Kiri says. Kiri kind of manipulates her. Her life's falling apart. She gives into this magic. And in some ways, this is sort of a negative arc. Red is giving into the Wilderwood magic, right, in her main plotline. But as she does that, that makes her a stronger person. It gets her closer to, like, what she deeply as a person wants, which was, you know, to be useful, to have value, to prove herself. And giving into her magic, using the Wilderwood magic is good. It's good for people. Like, there's this dark side to it, but it lets her protect Aemon and be closer to Aemon. Like, it's a very positive influence on her life. It helps her grow as a person, and that's, like, more of, like, a positive character arc. Whereas Neve is sort of doing the same thing. In order to save the people she cares about, she basically has to give in to this Shadowlands magic, this darker magic, but it doesn't have the same effect on her. She basically gets to the point where she's like, I want to save my sister, and I don't care what happens. I don't care if the kingdom has to burn to let it happen, almost. Maybe not that dramatic, but like it's definitely like you start worrying about her choices here, which provides a really, really good contrast to Red's development. And so as they're both kind of having these parallel storylines that both kind of work together, it goes in completely different directions for them. At the point that like the 75% mark for Neve, which is basically around when Red shows up and is basically like, no, 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 all the stuff you've done, you did not need to do it. And Neve's like, no, you've been controlled, whatever, whatever. Like, that's the point where as the reader, you're kind of like, oh, like, Neve is lost. Like, she does not know what's going on. She's been corrupted by Curie. Like, she's not going to be able to help her sister. Like, she almost becomes an antagonist. So, this is my sort of final chart where I overlaid all the different plots so that you can sort of see them working together. So the dark green is Red's plot. You'll recognize the shape of that. The dotted green is the stakes of that. The pink is the romance, and then the blue is sort of Neve. So you can sort of see these kind of all build together. A lot of the moments are shared. Like you can see the break into two is a hinge with a little bit of a win and moving forward for Red, but it's sort of like a setback for the romance. The midpoint is sort of them both pulling together, but then the romance has a much stronger setback beforehand because that's when basically like he can't be with her and keep control over the Wilderwood. And then she's like running off and you have that dip here, but you still see the main plot stakes are increasing. The romantic tension is kind of increasing. And then this big rise over here where the romance kind of comes together at first is right after that big dark moment in Red's growth. So one of the things I really noticed here was that they're kind of, in a lot of ways, kind of building and growing around each other. Like, it's not directly, like, parallel, but you don't have moments where, like, all of a sudden there's tons of advancements and making progress in one of the plots while the other one is falling apart. Because as you switch between scenes and chapters that kind of focus on those different things, you would have this almost like whiplash feeling where if you're tense about one thing because it's not going well and the stakes are really high, but then in this other one it's like, you know, things are working well, like maybe those wouldn't go together as well. For most of this, anything that's significant that happens, whether it's a loss or a win, kind of is reflected across all of the plots to an extent. And you can sort of see that they're like the more mid-pointy moments of the other plots are also around that same timeline, if you want to say, about how the main plot advances. So they're not that separate. They're all kind of intertwined, which is advice that I've seen when working with multiple plots, is that you want the moments to kind of be around each other because those are times where the feeling of the book is going to change, right? Like in the fun and games section, like, you know, it's high, you know, lots of things are happening, it's exciting, it's like, oh, cool, whatever, whatever, but like, it doesn't have that same, like, high tension stakes feel, emotional impact as maybe, like, the second half does after the midpoint. And you also don't want to feel like one of them has resolved, one of these plots has resolved while the other one is falling apart, because then it's like, does that undermine the impact of the other plots? But yeah, so you can kind of, you know, get your own interpretations from this. If you have any questions about this or like why I think things are a certain way or kind of disagree or like want to debate, please, please, please post in the comments because I would absolutely love to talk about it. This has been so cool for me. Like when I first started sort of doing this, it was incredibly overwhelming. Like I started mapping out everything on that element sheet, right? And I was like, this is so much stuff. How do I put this into a format where I can sort of wrap my head around it and understand what's going on and notice patterns and learn something from it? I think I really do want to do more of these, and I think the next one I do will be based off a multi-POV, more complicated story, which will be challenging. I'm hoping I'll eventually be able to notice these things as I'm reading and be like, oh, you know, this is this kind of a beat, this is the break into three, this is the all is lost moment, because the more times you see it and see its effectiveness and can understand why it was done the way it was, I feel like the better that I will be as a writer at being able to orchestrate those things, know how to edit my stories, build stronger plots just innately because I'll understand it more. I want to do more. I'd like to share them if you think this was useful, so definitely let me know if you want me to do more of these. And I might even share my own. I would probably share the graphs and the visuals and not like what's happening at each beat because that would be spoilers. And I might not even tell you exactly what the plots are, just like vaguely like vague what the plots are. If you're interested in that, let me know. Yeah, I hope this was useful. I found this incredibly useful. I'm excited to do more of this stuff later. I'll see you next time.